Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, England was going through a rough time with endless bombing. People tried to live normal lives just the same. The King and Queen kept working with Churchill and tried to keep the country's morale up. Then America got attacked by Japan and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered the war. Things still didn't improve at first, but let's see what the King and Queen are up to today. A happy family moment happened in the spring. Princess Elizabeth, who was nearly 16, was to be confirmed. Her parents asked Cosmo Lang, who was about to retire as Archbishop of Canterbury, to carry out the service. Queen Mary thought of him as a friend in woe. The service was held March 28th at a private chapel at Windsor Castle. It was simple and touching. Princess Elizabeth took her solemn vows before the Archbishop. The Queen thought that Lang was wonderful, so straightforward, so inspiring. On Easter Sunday, the princess took her first communion. She walked with her parents from Royal Lodge to the Royal Chapel, the little church just beyond the garden. Then they went home for breakfast. The Queen wrote to Queen Mary that it was nice to be together and quiet after these years of war and turmoil and perpetual anxiety, for even a few moments of true peace. The Queen didn't like Cosmo Lang leaving, but she found a kindred spirit in Edward Woods, the Bishop of Lichfield. He became her personal bishop for many years, and he helped the King and Queen with their speeches. The Bishop Woods agreed with the Queen that there was a need of an occasional retreat or quiet day in which to recover one's soul and spiritual balance. The Queen believed, like many, that the war between Britain and Germany was between a nation that was still fundamentally Christian and one which had abandoned faith for godless materialism. The horrors of fascism show what could happen when a great nation forsook the teachings of Christ. The Queen always found both strength and comfort in prayer. The suffering and the fears of war made her and the King more devout. It was not unusual. Churches were much fuller during the war than they had been in the late 1930s. The Queen prayed every day, and she continued to correspond with the Bishop of Lichfield on private spiritual matters and on other border subjects, and he sent her many books. Disasters continued. The Japanese swept the Allies out of the Philippines and the South Pacific, and they captured Burma, and they positioned themselves at the gates of India. By the end of April 1942, the Luftwaffe began a series of attacks on English heritage. These bombings were directed at historic towns such as Exeter, Bath, Norwich, York, and Canterbury, ancient cities which had no war industries and which were targets only for cultural assault. Over 1,500 people were killed in these raids. The King and Queen were outraged by the destruction. Visiting Exeter after 2 nights of bombing, they walked through the ruins of one of the oldest cities in England. It had been hit on 2 separate nights. The main street was smashed to pieces. 3 historic buildings, 5 churches, St. Luke's College, and the old city hospital built in 1700 were demolished, and so were at least 2,000 homes. A young schoolboy named Raymond Leopard, he later became an international conductor and a friend of Queen Elizabeth. He remembered how the King and Queen went all around Bath, climbing over rubble, talking to everyone, unguarded, and caringly sympathetic. One of the Queen's regiments, the Queen's Base, was deployed in North Africa, December 1941, and there were considerable losses of men and tanks when trying to stem Rommel's advance north of Jedediah at the end of January 1942. At the beginning of June of 1942, the King and Queen were in Scotland. The King inspected the fleet, and the Queen went to the palace of Holyrood House, which had its windows broken by nearby bombing. Then they spent 2 days on the Royal Train in Cambridgeshire, visiting the Royal Air Force stations. At the end of June, the King and Queen made an official visit to Ulster, where they stayed with friends, the Duke and Duchess of Abercorn. At Harland and Wolff's shipyard, they were mobbed by a boisterous, happy crowd. The next day came a visit to a new and vital installation, the United States Army camp near Ballykindler. They were impressed by the charm and intelligence of the officers and their excellent equipment, especially a remarkable little portable wireless sending and receiving set that they called the walkie-talkie. The King and Queen were at Balmoral, and the weather was bad, and they were dining with their guests when the King was called to the phone. He came back to the table in distress and passed a card to the Queen on which he had written in pencil, "Darling, what shall we do about ending dinner? I'm afraid George," this was the King's brother, He has been killed flying to Iceland. He left Invergordon at 1:30 p.m. and hit a mountain near Wick. The Queen caught the eye of the Duchess of Gloucester, who was sitting next to the King, and signaled her to rise with the other ladies and leave the room. The Duchess said while they were in the drawing room, they assumed that Queen Mary must have died. Then the Queen left us and came back with the King, who told us that it was the Duke of Kent who had been killed. The war had brought out the best in the Duke. He had asked to be given military duties and was created an Air Commodore in the Royal Air Force. His task was to oversee and inspect Royal Air Force facilities, both at home and abroad. In 1941, he had visited the Canadian flying schools, which were training pilots for the defense of Britain. He then went to the United States and met with President and Mrs. Roosevelt, and they were charmed by him. On the day he died, he was on the Sunderland flying boat bound from Invergordon to a Royal Air Force base in Iceland. The plane never should have taken off in such poor conditions. It was flying too low in thick fog when it hit the top of a hill on the Duke of Portland's Langwell estate. There were conspiracy theories, but the Duke's death seemed to have been a case of pilot error. The King and the Queen were upset. The King wrote in his diary that after the funeral 4 days later at St. George's Chapel, he had a great difficulty in preventing himself from breaking down. No other family funeral had affected him so much. The Queen knew she would miss the Duke greatly, too. She thought of him more as a brother than a brother-in-law. She said she could talk to him about many family affairs, for he had a quick and sensitive mind and a very good and useful social sense. And she said we had a great many jokes, too. She wrote to her brother David, who was in Washington, the Duke's death was such a dreadful waste. He was doing such a very good work and becoming so helpful to Bertie. We shall miss him very much. Now they wondered how to help the Duke's widow, Princess Marina. The King tried to ease her grief by arranging for her sister, Princess Olga of Yugoslavia, who was in exile in South Africa, with her husband Prince Paul, to come and stay with Princess Marina at her house, Copena, in Buckinghamshire. Well, this wasn't easy because Prince Paul was now regarded as a man who had collaborated with the Germans, but both women were grateful when they got together. Queen Mary was, of course, upset. George was her favorite son. She was moved when she got a telegram from her eldest son, the Duke of Windsor, asking for details of what happened. And she wrote an 8-page letter. The first line showed her deep sorrow. Most darling David, in this terrible hour of grief at the passing of our darling, precious Georgie, my thoughts go out to you, who are so far away from us all, knowing how devoted you were to him. At the end of the letter, she wrote, I send a kind message to your wife, who will help you to bear your sorrow. The Duke replied by hand, and when his mother saw his handwriting after so many years, she gave a gasp of pleasure. He thanked her for the sweet letter and said that, but for Wallace's love and comfort, he would have felt completely lost. He was pained by the 6 years split with his mother, and he still hoped it would be mended and that he could bring Wallace to see her. He wrote, I can never begin to tell you how intensified has become our great love for each other in the 5 years we've been married. The Duke wrote to the King that their mother was certainly a most courageous and noble person, and it's hard that in her later years she should have had yet another great and bitter blow to bear. Her fortitude is indeed an example to us all, and the King sent this letter to their mother. Queen Mary copied out the words and added, I think this was very touching and nice of David. Queen Mary was glad the ice was broken and optimistic that the family crisis was finally past and things could be better in the family regarding the Duke. But then the Duke had to press his luck, and a few weeks later he tried to get his wife the title of HMS again. He wrote to Churchill about it, and Churchill consulted the King, who wrote to his mother that he thought it was impossible to reverse a decision taken with so much thought only 6 years ago. And Elizabeth agreed with it too. Queen Mary agreed with the King and Queen that this tiresome question of the Duchess's title should not be raised again. The strain of those weeks had the Queen come down with a bad cold, and it turned into bronchitis. She had to cancel her engagements for several weeks. September 1942, Mrs. Ronnie Gravel died. She had good qualities and remarkable energy, but her snobbery, her anti-Semitism, and her partiality for Hitler in the 1930s had made her many enemies. She had been a friend of the king and queen for almost 20 years. The queen said she would miss her very much. She was so shrewd, so kind, so amusingly unkind, so sharp, so fun, so naughty, and altogether a real person, a character, utterly Mrs. Ronald Greville, and no tinge of anything alien. A few days later, the queen learned that she, to her surprise, had been left the jewelry of Mrs. Greville. She also left £20,000 to Princess Margaret. What about Princess Elizabeth? That's what I was wondering. So the queen wrote about it to Queen Mary, and she said she admired beautiful stones, and I can't help thinking that most women do. Her mother-in-law teased her by saying, "No one has ever left her such jewelry, but I'm not really jealous. I just mentioned this as it came into my mind." So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, Princess Elizabeth got confirmed, and the Duke of Kent died. The Duke of Windsor tried once more to get his wife a royal title when he found the family was becoming a little more welcoming after the death of Brother George. It wasn't to be because it was thought that, out so carefully 6 years ago, they knew they couldn't change their minds about her title. The Queen got a surprise gift of jewelry from an old friend who died, and I had to think that Queen Mary was a little jealous because she loved jewelry too. And I hope that everyone enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would really help my channel to grow. In the descriptions part of my video, I'm going to place items on Amazon that if you decide you would like to order from, you just click on the link and it will take you to the Amazon page, and then I would get a small commission with no extra cost to you. All that aside, I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.